She had 3 silver coins and nowhere left to run. The blizzard screamed through the Montana pines like something alive and starving, and Clara Whitmore stood at the iron gates of a ranch she'd never seen, knowing that the man inside would either save her life or let the cold finish what poverty had started. When the door opened, Ethan Cross didn't offer warmth, he offered a deal. Marriage, not love, just survival. And in that moment, with frost already claiming her fingertips, Clara made the choice that would either destroy her or remake her into something the frontier had never seen coming. If you want to see how far a desperate bargain can go when bullets start flying and trust becomes the only currency that matters, stay with me to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The storm hit 3 hours before sundown, and by the time Clara realized she wasn't going to outrun it, the road had already disappeared beneath 2 feet of snow. She'd left Belmont that morning with everything she owned tied in a canvas sack: 2 dresses, a tin cup, a worn copy of Whitman's poems, and the 3 silver coins her mother had pressed into her palm the week before she died. The stagecoach driver had dropped her at the crossroads with a shrug and a warning that the next town was 15 miles north, and if the weather turned, she'd better find shelter fast. The weather had turned. Clara pulled her shawl tighter, but the wind tore through the wool like it wasn't even there. Her boots, already thin at the soles, crunched through the snow with a rhythm that had started to feel like a countdown. Her breath came in short, visible bursts. Her fingers had gone numb an hour ago, and now the cold was working its way up her wrists, methodical and patient. She didn't know where she was. The road had forked twice since the crossroads, and both times she'd chosen based on nothing but a guess and a prayer she wasn't sure anyone was listening to. The trees pressed in on both sides, their branches heavy with snow, and the sky had gone the color of old iron. And then, through the white haze, she saw it. A gate, iron, tall, and flanked by 2 stone posts that looked like they'd been standing there since before Montana had a name. Beyond the gate, a narrow drive cut through the snow, leading toward a shape that might have been a house, or might have been a shadow. Clara stopped, her legs shaking from cold and exhaustion, and stared at that gate like it was the last door in the world. Because maybe it was. She didn't know who lived there, didn't know if they'd help or turn her away. But the alternative was clear: keep walking and die, or knock and take her chances. Clara stepped forward, gripped the cold metal of the gate, and pushed. It didn't budge. She tried again, throwing her weight against it, but the snow had piled up on the other side, and her strength was nearly gone. Panic flared in her chest, sharp and bitter. She couldn't even get through the damned gate. "Help!" she shouted, but the wind swallowed her voice before it could travel 10 feet. She tried again, louder this time, her throat raw. "Please, someone!" Nothing. Clara sank against the gate, her knees buckling, and for a moment she considered just staying there. It would be easier. The cold was already pulling at her, promising rest, whispering that she'd done enough. Then the door of the house opened. A man stepped out onto the porch, a rifle in one hand, his silhouette broad and solid against the glow of the firelight behind him. He didn't move right away, just stood there, watching her through the snow like he was deciding whether she was real or some kind of hallucination the storm had conjured up. Clara forced herself to stand. She gripped the gate with both hands and shouted again, hoarse and desperate, "I need help!" The man didn't answer. He descended the porch steps slowly, his boots crunching through the snow, and crossed the yard toward her with the deliberate pace of someone who didn't rush for anything. When he reached the gate, he stopped on the other side and looked her over. Not with suspicion exactly, but with the kind of caution a person develops when they've learned the hard way that strangers usually bring trouble. "Gate's locked," he said. His voice was low, rough-edged, the kind of voice that didn't waste words. "I can see that," Clara shot back, teeth chattering. "Can you open it?" He studied her for another long moment, his gaze moving from her face to the canvas sack at her feet to the way her hands were shaking against the iron bars. Then he reached into his coat, pulled out a key, and unlocked the gate with a single efficient motion. It swung open and Clara stumbled through, nearly collapsing before the man caught her by the arm. His grip was firm, steadying, and for a second she just stood there, leaning into the support, too cold and tired to care about pride. "You lost?" he asked. "I was trying to get to Ridgefield," Clara said, her voice barely more than a rasp. "Stagecoach dropped me at the crossroads. I thought I could make it before the storm hit. Ridgefield's 20 miles north, the man said flatly. You wouldn't have made it another mile. Clara nodded because she already knew that. She'd known it for the last hour, maybe longer. I don't have anywhere else to go. The man's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or resignation. He glanced back toward the house, then at her again, and sighed like he'd just made a decision he didn't particularly like. Come on, he said, and started walking. Clara followed, her legs barely cooperating, her vision swimming at the edges. The yard was wide and open, the house looming larger as they approached. A 2-story structure with a wraparound porch and smoke curling from the chimney. It looked solid, permanent, the kind of place that had weathered 100 storms and would weather 100 more. The man pushed open the front door and gestured for her to go inside. The warmth hit her like a wall, so sudden and overwhelming that her knees buckled again. She caught herself on the doorframe, her breath coming in short, shaky gasps as her body tried to remember what heat felt like. The man closed the door behind them, shutting out the wind and the snow, and the silence that followed was almost startling. Clara looked around, taking in the room, wooden floors, a stone fireplace with a fire crackling inside, a long table surrounded by mismatched chairs, and 2 boys sitting on the floor near the hearth, staring at her like she'd just walked out of a ghost story. "Who's she?" the older boy asked. He looked about 10, with dark hair and sharp eyes that didn't miss much. "Don't know yet," the man said. He set his rifle against the wall and turned to Clara. "You got a name?" "Clara Whitmore." "Ethan Cross," he said, nodding toward the boys. "That's Jacob, the little one Samuel." Jacob continued to stare. Samuel, who couldn't have been more than 6, just blinked at her with wide eyes. "Sit down before you fall down," Ethan said, gesturing toward one of the chairs near the fire. Clara didn't argue. She sank into the chair, her whole body trembling as the warmth started to thaw her frozen limbs. It hurt. Pins and needles crawling up her arms and legs. But she didn't care. She was inside. She was alive. Ethan disappeared into another room and came back with a blanket, which he dropped over her shoulders without ceremony. Then he poured something from a kettle on the stove into a tin cup and handed it to her. "Drink," he said. Clara wrapped her hands around the cup, savoring the heat against her palms, and took a cautious sip. It was bitter, strong, and scalding hot, but it was the best thing she'd tasted in weeks. "Thank you," she said quietly. Ethan didn't respond. He pulled out a chair across from her and sat down, his arms folded on the table, and waited. Clara knew what he was waiting for. An explanation. A reason. Some kind of story that would make sense of why a woman was wandering alone through a blizzard with nothing but a canvas sack and 3 silver coins. "I was a school teacher," she said finally. "In Belmont. The town council decided they didn't need one anymore. They gave me 2 weeks' notice and told me to find work somewhere else." "Why Ridgefield?" Ethan asked. "I heard they were hiring a clerk position at the general store. I wrote to them last month and they said to come by if I was serious." Clara looked down at the cup in her hands. "I didn't have the money for a full fare, so I took the stagecoach as far as I could and thought I'd walk the rest." "That was stupid," Jacob said from the floor. "Jacob," Ethan said sharply, and the boy shut his mouth, but he didn't look sorry. Clara didn't blame him. It had been stupid, desperate and reckless and stupid, and she'd almost died because of it. "I don't have family," she continued, her voice quieter now. "My mother passed last year. My father was gone long before that. There's no one waiting for me anywhere." She paused, then added, "I had $3 when I left Belmont. I spent 2 on the stagecoach. I've got what's left in my pocket, and that's it." Ethan was silent for a long moment, his gaze steady and unreadable. Then he leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "You can stay the night," he said. "Storm's not letting up any time soon. In the morning, if the roads are clear, I'll take you into town." Clara nodded, relief washing over her so fast it made her dizzy. "Thank you." Ethan stood, signaling the end of the conversation, and looked at the boys. "Jacob, get some blankets from the cupboard. Samuel, you go with him." The boys scrambled to their feet and disappeared down the hall, leaving Clara and Ethan alone in the firelight. "You'll sleep in the spare room," Ethan said. "It's small, but it's warm." "That's more than enough," Clara said. Ethan nodded, then turned toward the stove, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the glow. He moved with the kind of efficiency that came from years of doing things alone, without help, without complaint. Clara watched him for a moment, then looked around the room again, taking in the details she'd missed before. The boots lined up by the door, the coats hanging on hooks, the small wooden toys scattered near the hearth. It was a home, but it felt incomplete, like something essential had been removed and never replaced. "Your wife?" Clara asked quietly, then immediately regretted it. Ethan's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't turn around. "Dead," he said flatly. 2 years now. Clara closed her eyes, cursing herself. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," Ethan said. "You didn't know." Jacob and Samuel came back with the blankets, their arms full of worn wool, and Ethan took them without a word. He handed one to Clara and draped the other over the back of a chair. "Come on," he said. "I'll show you the room." Clara followed him down a narrow hallway, her legs still unsteady, and he pushed open a door at the end. The room was small, just as he'd said, barely big enough for a bed, a chair, and a washstand, but it was clean, and the window was shuttered tight against the storm. "Wash basin's there," Ethan said, nodding toward the stand. "Outhouse is around back, but I wouldn't recommend it tonight. Use the pot under the bed if you need to." Clara nodded, too exhausted to be embarrassed. Ethan lingered in his doorway for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he said, "You're lucky you made it here." "I know," Clara said. He nodded once, then turned and walked back down the hall, leaving her alone. Clara sank onto the bed, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, and stared at the closed door. She was warm. She was safe. She was alive. But tomorrow, she'd be back out in the cold, heading toward a town that might not even have the job she'd been promised, with nothing but the last of her money and a fading hope that something, somewhere, would finally go right. She lay down, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and closed her eyes. Outside, the storm howled on. Clara woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of voices. She sat up slowly, disoriented, her body aching from the cold and the long walk. The room was dim, the shutters still closed, but a thin strip of light bled through the gap at the bottom of the door. She stood, wrapped the blanket around herself, and opened the door. The house was alive with morning. Ethan at the stove, Jacob setting the table, Samuel sitting on the floor tying his boots. The fire was still burning, and the warmth felt like a miracle all over again. "Morning," Ethan said without turning around. "Coffee's on the table. Breakfast'll be ready in a minute." Clara crossed the room and poured herself a cup, the steam curling up into her face. She took a sip and felt the bitterness cut through the fog in her head. "Snow stopped," Ethan said, flipping something in a pan. "But the roads are still buried. Won't be clear for another day, maybe 2. Clara's stomach sank. "I can't stay that long." "You don't have a choice," Ethan said simply. "You leave now. You'll freeze before you get a mile." Clara opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. He was right, and they both knew it. Ethan set a plate of eggs and bacon on the table, followed by a second and a third. The boys descended on the food like wolves, and Clara sat down across from them, her hands wrapped around the coffee cup. "Eat," Ethan said, nodding toward the plate he'd set in front of her. Clara hesitated, then picked up a fork. The food was simple, unseasoned, but it was hot and filling, and she ate slowly, savoring every bite. Ethan sat at the head of the table, his own plate untouched, and watched her with that same steady, unreadable gaze. "You said you were a school teacher," he said finally. Clara nodded. "For 3 years, taught reading, writing, arithmetic, mostly to children, but I had a few older students too." "You any good at it?" "I like to think so," Clara said. "The students seemed to learn. The parents didn't complain." "Then why'd they let you go?" Clara set down her fork, her appetite suddenly gone. "The council said the town couldn't afford to pay me anymore. But the truth is, they didn't like me. I didn't go to church. I didn't socialize. I kept to myself, and that made me inconvenient." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. "People don't trust women who don't fit," Clara continued, her voice sharper now. "Especially women who don't need their approval to survive." Ethan studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, like he understood something he hadn't before. "You got any plans?" he asked. "Besides Ridgefield?" "Not really," Clara admitted. I was hoping the store job would work out and then I'd figure out the rest from there. And if it doesn't? Clara looked down at her plate. I don't know. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his arms folded, and the silence stretched out between them. Then he said, I've got a proposition. Clara looked up, her heart kicking against her ribs. I need help, Ethan said bluntly. The boys need someone here during the day, someone to cook, clean, teach them when I can't, someone who can hold this place together when I'm out working the ranch. He paused, his gaze locked on hers. And I need a wife. Clara's breath caught. What? Not a real wife, Ethan said quickly. Not in the way you're thinking. I'm talking about a business arrangement. You stay here, help with the house and the boys, and I'll give you a roof, food, and a place to belong. No one in town will question it if we're married. They'll leave you alone, and you'll have security. Clara stared at him, her mind racing. You're asking me to marry you. I'm asking you to survive, Ethan said. Same as you were trying to do when you knocked on my gate. Clara's hands tightened around the coffee cup. Why me? You don't even know me. I know enough, Ethan said. You're not afraid of hard work. You're not afraid of being alone. And you're desperate enough to say yes. The words stung, but Clara couldn't argue with them. What if I say no? She asked. Ethan shrugged. Then I'll take you to Ridgefield when the road's clear and you'll take your chances. Clara looked at Jacob and Samuel, who were watching the conversation with wide eyes and half-eaten breakfasts. She looked at the house, the fire, the warmth, and she thought about the storm outside and the long, cold road ahead. I'll think about it, she said. Ethan nodded. You've got until tomorrow. And with that, he stood, grabbed his coat, and walked out into the snow, leaving Clara alone with two boys, a half-finished breakfast, and a choice that would change everything. Clara spent the rest of that morning watching Ethan through the kitchen window. He moved through the snow like it was nothing, checking fences, hauling feed to the livestock, his shoulders broad against the white expanse. The boys had gone out with him after breakfast, bundled in coats too big for their frames, and she could hear their voices carrying across the yard, Jacob's sharp and certain, Samuel's higher and softer. She washed the breakfast dishes in water she'd heated on the stove, her hands moving automatically while her mind turned over Ethan's offer. Marriage. A business arrangement. Security in exchange for labor. Survival in exchange for belonging to a house that didn't really want her but needed her all the same. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even kind. But it was honest, and Clara had learned a long time ago that honesty was rarer than kindness and worth more. She dried the last plate and set it on the shelf, then stood there staring at the empty kitchen. The house was clean but worn, functional but joyless. There were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floors, no pictures on the walls. It looked like a place where people existed but didn't live. The door opened and Samuel came in first, his cheeks red from the cold, snow clinging to his boots. He looked at Clara, then quickly looked away like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to acknowledge her. Boots off, Clara said automatically, the teacher in her surfacing before she could stop it. Samuel froze, his eyes widening. She's not Ma, Jacob said from the doorway, his voice flat and challenging. You don't have to listen to her. Clara turned to face him, keeping her expression neutral. I'm not trying to be your mother, but if you track snow through the house, someone's going to have to clean it up, and I'm guessing that someone is me. Jacob stared at her, his jaw set, clearly trying to decide if this was a fight worth picking. Then he kicked off his own boots, hard enough to make a point, and walked past her into the kitchen. Samuel followed, quieter, his boots abandoned by the door. Ethan came in last, shaking snow from his coat. He glanced at the boots lined up by the door, then at Clara, but he didn't say anything. He just hung his coat on the hook and moved toward the stove. Jacob, get the wood stacked, Ethan said. Samuel, you help him. I'm hungry, Jacob said. Then work faster, Ethan replied, not looking up. Jacob's mouth tightened, but he didn't argue. He grabbed Samuel by the arm and pulled him toward the door, and the two of them disappeared outside again. Clara watched them go, then turned to Ethan. He doesn't like me. He doesn't like anyone, Ethan said. Don't take it personal. Does he know? About your offer? Ethan shook his head. Not yet. Figured I'd wait until you made up your mind. Clara folded her arms, leaning against the counter. What happens if I say yes and it doesn't work? What if the boys hate me, or the town refuses to accept it, or you decide 6 months from now that this was a mistake? Ethan looked at her, his gaze steady. Then we deal with it, same as anything else. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got, Ethan said. He crossed the room and poured himself a cup of coffee, his movements deliberate. Look, I'm not going to lie to you. This won't be easy. The boys are angry, and they've got a right to be. The town's going to talk, because that's what towns do. And I'm not the kind of man who's going to make this comfortable for you. But you'll have a place here. You'll have a purpose, and no one will be able to take that away from you as long as I'm standing. Clara studied him, trying to read the man behind the words. He wasn't offering her love or even friendship. He was offering her a transaction, cold and practical, the kind of deal you made when all the other options had run out. But he was also offering her something she hadn't had in a long time, a choice that didn't end with her losing. I need to know one thing, Clara said. If I say yes, are you going to expect me to share your bed? Ethan's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, surprise maybe, or discomfort. No, he said firmly. This is business. You'll have your own room, your own space. I'm not looking for that. Clara nodded slowly, the knot in her chest loosening just a little. All right. All right, you'll think about it? Or all right, you'll do it? Ethan asked. Clara took a breath, then let it out. All right, I'll do it. Ethan set down his coffee cup. His gaze locked on hers. You're sure? No, Clara said honestly. But I'm out of better options, and you're offering me a way to survive. So I'll take it. Ethan nodded once, like that was all the confirmation he needed. We'll go into town tomorrow. Get it done at the courthouse. Simple and quick. And the boys? Clara asked. I'll tell them tonight. Clara's stomach twisted, imagining the conversation, the anger, the grief that would come pouring out. But she didn't argue. This was Ethan's house, Ethan's family, and if she was going to be part of it, she had to let him handle it his way. What do I do until then? She asked. Whatever you want, Ethan said. You're not a prisoner here. He grabbed his coat and headed back outside, leaving Clara alone in the kitchen again. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, trying to absorb the fact that she'd just agreed to marry a man she'd known for less than 24 hours. Then she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. By the time the boys came back in, she'd scrubbed the floors, wiped down the counters, and started a pot of stew on the stove. It wasn't much, but it was something, and Clara had learned that keeping her hands busy was the best way to keep her mind from spiraling. Jacob walked in first, saw the changes, and stopped in his tracks. What are you doing? Cleaning, Clara said simply. We didn't ask you to. I know, Clara said, but I'm here, and I'm not going to sit around doing nothing. Jacob's eyes narrowed. You think you're staying? Clara met his gaze, refusing to look away. I think that's up to your father. Jacob opened his mouth to say something else, but Samuel tugged on his sleeve, whispering something Clara couldn't hear. Jacob scowled, then turned and walked toward the fire, dragging his brother with him. Clara went back to stirring the stew, her heart pounding. She'd handled difficult students before, kids who tested her at every turn. But this was different. Jacob wasn't just testing her, he was protecting something, guarding a wound that hadn't healed, and she was the stranger, trying to step into the space his mother had left behind. Dinner that night was tense. Ethan sat at the head of the table, Jacob and Samuel on one side, Clara on the other. No one spoke. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons against bowls and the crackling of the fire. Clara ate slowly, keeping her eyes on her food, trying not to draw attention to herself. But she could feel Jacob watching her, his gaze heavy and hostile. Finally, Ethan set down his spoon and cleared his throat. Boys, I need to talk to you about something. Jacob looked up, his expression wary. Samuel just blinked, his spoon halfway to his mouth. Miss Whitmore is going to be staying here, Ethan said. Permanently. Jacob's face went hard. Why? Because I asked her to, Ethan said, and because this house needs someone to help run it. We don't need help, Jacob shot back. We've been fine without... We haven't been fine, Ethan interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. And you know it. Jacob's jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. She's going to marry me, Ethan continued. Tomorrow, at the courthouse. And after that, she's going to be part of this family. The silence that followed was suffocating. Samuel's eyes went wide, darting between his father and Clara like he was trying to understand. Jacob just stared at Ethan, his face flushed, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "You can't," Jacob said, his voice shaking. "You can't just replace her." "I'm not replacing anyone," Ethan said quietly. "Your mother's gone, Jacob. She's not coming back, and we can't keep living like she is." "I hate you," Jacob said, his voice breaking. He shoved his chair back and ran from the table, his footsteps pounding down the hallway. A door slammed, and then there was silence. Samuel sat frozen, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Ethan exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. "Go check on your brother," he said to Samuel. "Make sure he's all right." Samuel nodded and slipped from his chair, disappearing down the hall after Jacob. Clara sat across from Ethan, her hands folded in her lap, her chest tight. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Don't be," Ethan said. He needed to hear it. "He's not wrong, though," Clara said. "I'm replacing her. In his eyes, that's exactly what I'm doing." Ethan looked at her, his expression weary. "You're not replacing her. You're just filling a space that's been empty too long. There's a difference." Clara wasn't sure she believed that, but she didn't argue. She stood, cleared the table in silence, and washed the dishes while Ethan sat by the fire, staring into the flames. When she finished, she excused herself and went to her room, closing the door behind her. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands shaking, and let herself feel the full weight of what she'd agreed to. Tomorrow, she'd stand in a courthouse and marry a stranger. She'd become a stepmother to 2 boys who didn't want her. She'd walk into a life that wasn't hers and try to make it fit. And she'd do it all because the alternative was freezing to death in a Montana snowstorm. Clara lay down, pulled the blanket over herself, and closed her eyes. She didn't sleep. The courthouse in Ridgefield was a squat brick building that smelled like old paper and tobacco. Ethan had driven them into town in a wagon that rattled over the frozen roads, and Clara sat beside him in silence, her hands folded in her lap, her stomach churning. The boys had stayed home. Ethan had decided it was better that way, and Clara hadn't argued. Inside, a clerk with ink-stained fingers and a bored expression pushed a ledger across the counter. "Names? Ethan Cross and Clara Whitmore," Ethan said. The clerk looked up, his eyebrows rising slightly. "This a wedding or a registry?" "Wedding," Ethan said flatly. The clerk's gaze shifted to Clara, lingering a little too long, then back to Ethan. "You got a witness?" Ethan nodded toward the door, where an older man in a worn coat was waiting. "He'll do." The clerk shrugged, dipped his pen in ink, and started filling out the form. $5. Ethan pulled a bill from his pocket and set it on the counter. The ceremony, if it could even be called that, took less than 3 minutes. The clerk read from a card in a monotone voice, asked if they agreed to the terms, and had them sign the ledger. The witness scrawled his name below theirs, and that was it. Clara was married. She stood there, staring at her name in the ledger, Clara Whitmore Cross, and felt nothing. No joy, no relief, just a hollow sense of finality. "You're all set," the clerk said, sliding a certificate across the counter. "Congratulations." Ethan took the certificate, folded it, and tucked it into his coat. Then he turned to Clara. "Let's go." They walked out into the cold, and Ethan helped her into the wagon without a word. The ride back was just as silent as the ride in. The only sound the creak of the wheels and the crunch of snow under the horses' hooves. Clara stared at the frozen landscape, her mind numb, and wondered if this was what the rest of her life would feel like. When they got back to the ranch, Jacob was waiting on the porch, his arms folded, his face a mask of cold fury. "It's done?" he asked as Ethan climbed down from the wagon. "It's done," Ethan said. Jacob's gaze shifted to Clara, and the hatred in his eyes was so raw it made her flinch. "You're not my mother," he said, his voice low and venomous. "You'll never be my mother." "I know," Clara said quietly. Jacob stared at her for another moment, then turned and stormed back inside, slamming the door behind him. Ethan sighed, his shoulders sagging. "Give him time." "How much time?" Clara asked. Ethan didn't answer. The days that followed were some of the hardest Clara had ever lived. She woke before dawn, built the fire, made breakfast, and tried to carve out a space for herself in a house that didn't want her. The boys avoided her when they could and tolerated her when they couldn't. Jacob barely spoke to her, and when he did, his words were clipped and cold. Samuel was quieter, more hesitant, but he followed his brother's lead. Ethan was gone most of the day, working the ranch, and when he came back he was too tired to do much more than eat and collapse by the fire. He didn't talk to Clara, didn't ask how her day had been, didn't seem to notice the effort she was putting in just to keep the house running. And Clara felt herself shrinking, folding inward, trying to take up as little space as possible. But she didn't leave. One afternoon, about a week after the wedding, Clara was kneading dough at the kitchen table when Samuel wandered in. He stood in the doorway, watching her with wide, uncertain eyes. "Can I help?" he asked quietly. Clara looked up, surprised. "You want to help me bake?" Samuel nodded. Clara hesitated, then gestured to the chair beside her. "All right, come here." Samuel climbed onto the chair, and Clara showed him how to fold the dough, how to press it down with the heels of his hands, how to shape it into something useful. They worked in silence for a while, and then Samuel said, "Ma used to make bread." Clara's hands stilled. "Did she?" Samuel nodded. "She made it every Sunday. Jacob liked it with butter." Clara swallowed hard, her throat tight. "I'm sure it was good." "It was," Samuel said. He paused, then added, "Yours is good too." Clara looked at him, this small boy with flour on his hands and grief in his eyes, and felt something crack open in her chest. "Thank you," she said softly. They finished the bread together, and when it came out of the oven, golden and steaming, Samuel took a piece to Jacob without being asked. Jacob didn't say anything, but he ate it, and Clara took that as a small, fragile victory. That night, as she was washing the dishes, Ethan came into the kitchen and leaned against the counter. "Samuel said you let him help with the bread," he said. Clara nodded, her hands still in the soapy water. "He asked." Ethan was quiet for a moment, then said, "That's good. He needs that." Clara didn't know what to say, so she didn't say anything. Ethan watched her for a moment longer, then pushed off the counter and headed toward the door, but he stopped before leaving, his hand on the frame. "You're doing all right," he said quietly. "Better than I expected." Clara looked at him, surprised, but he was already gone. She stood there, her hands dripping, and let herself feel the smallest flicker of something that might have been hope. 2 weeks after the wedding, a woman showed up at the door. Clara answered the knock, wiping her hands on her apron, and found herself face to face with a sharp-eyed woman in a fur-trimmed coat and a hat that looked like it cost more than Clara's entire wardrobe. "I'm Margaret Dalton," the woman said, her voice crisp and assessing. "I live at the adjoining ranch. I heard Ethan got himself a wife, and I had to see for myself." Clara's stomach tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. "Clara Cross." Margaret's gaze swept over her, taking in the plain dress, the flour-dusted apron, the lack of jewelry or pretense. "Well," she said, "you're certainly not what I expected." "I'm sorry to disappoint," Clara said evenly. Margaret's lips twitched, like she was trying not to smile. "I didn't say I was disappointed. May I come in?" Clara stepped aside, and Margaret swept into the house like she owned it. She looked around, her sharp eyes missing nothing: the clean floors, the neatly stacked wood, the pot of soup simmering on the stove. "You've been busy," Margaret said. "I do what needs doing," Clara said. Margaret turned to face her, her expression shrewd. "The town's been talking. They're saying Ethan married you out of desperation, that you're some kind of charity case." Clara's jaw tightened, but she didn't rise to the bait. "Let them talk." Margaret studied her for a moment, then nodded, like Clara had passed some kind of test. "Good answer. You're going to need that spine if you want to survive out here." She stayed for tea, asking pointed questions and offering unsolicited advice, and by the time she left, Clara felt like she'd been through an interrogation. But as Margaret climbed into her wagon, she turned back and said, "If you need anything, you come find me. Out here, women have to look out for each other. Heaven knows the men won't." Clara watched her drive away, unsure if she'd just made a friend or an enemy. That night, she told Ethan about the visit. "Margaret's all right," Ethan said. "She's nosy, but she's fair. If she likes you, she'll defend you. If she doesn't, she'll make your life difficult." "And which one am I?" Clara asked. Ethan almost smiled. "She came back to check on you, didn't she? That means you passed." Clara wasn't sure what she'd passed, but she'd take it. The winter dragged on, brutal and relentless, but Clara kept working. She cooked, cleaned, mended clothes, taught Samuel his letters, and slowly, painfully slowly, began to earn Jacob's grudging respect. It happened in small moments. Jacob stopped slamming doors when she was around. He started saying thank you when she handed him his plate. He even asked her once, stiffly, if she needed help carrying firewood. Clara said yes, and they worked in silence, side by side, and when they were done, Jacob didn't run away. Ethan noticed. He didn't say much, but Clara could see it in the way he watched her with the boys, the way his expression softened when Samuel laughed at something she said, the way he nodded when Jacob sat at the table without being told. And late one night, when the house was quiet and the fire was dying, Ethan said, "You're good with them." Clara looked up from the shirt she was mending. "They're good boys. They just needed someone to see that." Ethan was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire. Then he said, "I'm glad you stayed." Clara's hand stilled, the needle frozen mid-stitch. "I know this isn't what you wanted," Ethan continued, "and I know it hasn't been easy. But you've made a difference here. The boys, they're better. The house is better. I'm better." Clara didn't know what to say. She'd spent so long believing she was just filling a space, just surviving, that the idea she'd actually mattered felt foreign. "Thank you," she said quietly. Ethan nodded, then stood and headed toward his room, leaving Clara alone by the fire. She sat there for a long time, staring at the flames, and let herself believe, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where she belonged. The trouble started on a Wednesday in late February, when the snow had finally begun to thin and the days were stretching just a little longer. Clara was in the kitchen cutting potatoes when she heard the horses. Not Ethan's steady rhythm coming back from the north pasture, but something faster, harder, multiple animals moving with purpose. She set down the knife and wiped her hands on her apron, moving toward the window. 3 riders were coming up the drive, their faces shadowed beneath wide-brimmed hats, their horses kicking up clouds of dirty snow. They didn't slow as they approached the house. They rode right up to the porch like they owned the place. Clara's pulse quickened. She glanced toward the hallway where Jacob and Samuel were supposed to be doing their lessons, then back at the window. One of the men dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a thick beard and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much and cared about too little. The other 2 stayed on their horses, watching the house with the kind of stillness that made Clara's skin crawl. The bearded man climbed the porch steps and knocked, 3 sharp raps that rattled the door in its frame. Clara took a breath, squared her shoulders, and opened it. The man looked her over, his gaze slow and deliberate, then smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. "Afternoon, ma'am. Is Ethan Cross around?" "He's working," Clara said, keeping her voice steady. "Can I help you?" "Depends," the man said. "You his wife?" Clara hesitated, then nodded. "I am." The man's smile widened, showing teeth that were yellowed and crooked. "Well, ain't that something? Heard he'd gone and got himself hitched. Didn't believe it till now." "What do you want?" Clara asked. "Just a conversation," the man said. "Nothing to worry your pretty head about." Clara's jaw tightened, but she didn't rise to the bait. "If you want to talk to my husband, you'll have to come back later." The man's smile faded. "That's not real convenient for me." "It'll have to do," Clara said, and started to close the door. The man's hand shot out, catching the edge of the door and holding it open. "Now that's not very hospitable." Clara's heart slammed against her ribs, but she didn't step back. "Take your hand off my door." The man leaned in, his breath sour and hot. "Or what?" "Or I'll put a bullet in you," Clara said, her voice cold and flat. The man blinked, surprised, then laughed, a low, ugly sound. "You got a gun, little lady?" "I do," Clara said, though she didn't. The rifle was hanging above the fireplace, and she had no idea if it was even loaded, but she kept her eyes locked on his, refusing to flinch. The man studied her for a long moment, then slowly pulled his hand back. "You got some fire in you, I like that." "Leave," Clara said. The man tipped his hat, still grinning. "Tell your husband we stopped by. Tell him Garrett Voss wants a word." He turned and walked back to his horse, swinging into the saddle with practiced ease. The 3 of them rode off, slow and deliberate, like they had all the time in the world. Clara waited until they were out of sight before she closed the door, her hand shaking. She leaned against it, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts, and tried to calm the panic rising in her chest. Jacob appeared in the hallway, his face pale. Who were they? I don't know, Clara said. But they're gone now. They didn't look like friends, Jacob said. They weren't, Clara said. She straightened, forcing her hands to stop shaking. Where's Samuel? In the back room, Jacob said. I told him to stay there. Good, Clara said. Keep him there until your father gets back. Jacob hesitated, then nodded and disappeared down the hall. Clara went back to the kitchen, but she couldn't focus on the potatoes. She kept looking out the window, watching the empty drive, waiting for the riders to come back. When Ethan finally rode in an hour later, Clara met him at the door. We had visitors, she said without preamble. Ethan's expression hardened. Who? 3 men. The one in charge said his name was Garrett Voss. Ethan went very still, his jaw clenching. What did he want? He wanted to talk to you, Clara said. I told him to come back later. He didn't like that. Ethan's gaze sharpened. Did he threaten you? Not in so many words, Clara said, but he made it clear he didn't appreciate being turned away. Ethan swore under his breath, then turned and walked toward the house. Clara followed, her stomach twisting. Inside, Ethan went straight to the rifle above the fireplace and checked the chamber. It was loaded. He pulled a box of ammunition from the cupboard and set it on the table, then looked at Clara. You know how to shoot? He asked. Clara hesitated. I fired a gun before. Once. That's not the same thing, Ethan said. He picked up the rifle and held it out to her. Come on. He took her outside, behind the house where the land opened up into a wide, empty field. He set up a row of cans on a fence post, then handed her the rifle. Hold it like this, he said, adjusting her grip. Stock against your shoulder, tight. You don't want the recoil knocking you back. Clara nodded, her hands unsteady. Look down the sight, Ethan said, standing behind her. Line it up with the target. When you're ready, squeeze the trigger. Don't pull. Squeeze. Clara took a breath, aimed at the center can, and squeezed. The rifle kicked hard, the shot cracking through the cold air, and the bullet went wide, kicking up dirt 5 feet to the left of the target. Try again, Ethan said. Clara reloaded, adjusted her stance, and fired. This time the bullet hit the fence post, splintering the wood but missing the can. Better, Ethan said. Again. They stayed out there for an hour, Clara firing until her shoulder ached and her ears rang. By the end, she could hit the cans more often than she missed them. Ethan took the rifle back, his expression grim. If those men come back and I'm not here, you don't open the door. You take this rifle, you get the boys to the back room, and you wait. If they try to come inside, you shoot first and ask questions later. Understand? Clara nodded, her throat tight. Who is Garrett Voss? Ethan's jaw clenched. He works for a man named Silas Harding. Harding owns half the land in this county, and he wants the other half. He's been trying to buy me out for 2 years, and I've told him no every time. So he's sending men to intimidate you, Clara said. That's how it starts, Ethan said, but it doesn't end there. Clara's stomach dropped. What are you saying? I'm saying this is going to get worse before it gets better, Ethan said, and I need you to be ready. That night, Ethan didn't go to bed. He sat by the fire with the rifle across his lap, his eyes on the door, waiting for trouble that didn't come. Clara stayed up with him, mending clothes she didn't need to mend, just so he wouldn't be alone. You should sleep, Ethan said finally, his voice rough from disuse. So should you, Clara said. Ethan almost smiled. I will, eventually. Clara set down the shirt she'd been working on and looked at him. Tell me about Harding. Ethan was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. Then he said, Silas Harding came to Montana 15 years ago with money and ambition. He bought up land, crushed anyone who got in his way, and built an empire. Now he controls the Cattlemen's Association, the rail contracts, half the politicians in the territory. If you cross him, you don't stay in business long. And you crossed him, Clara said. I told him I wasn't selling, Ethan said. That was enough. Why does he want your land so badly? Clara asked. Water, Ethan said. My property sits on the best water source for 50 miles. Without it, his cattle operation suffers. With it, he controls everything. Clara's chest tightened. So he's going to keep pushing until you give in. Or until I'm dead, Ethan said flatly. whichever comes first. The words hung in the air between them, cold and heavy. I won't let that happen, Clara said. Ethan looked at her, something shifting in his expression. You don't have to fight this battle. Yes, I do, Clara said. This is my home now, too. Ethan held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly, like he was seeing her for the first time. All right, he said quietly. Then we fight. The next 2 weeks were tense and watchful. Ethan hired 2 ranch hands, grizzled, hard-eyed men who didn't ask questions and knew how to handle trouble. He moved the cattle closer to the house, set up a rotation for night watches, and made sure the boys knew to stay within sight of the buildings. Clara kept the rifle close, learning its weight, its balance, the way it felt in her hands. She practiced when she could, alone in the field behind the house, until she could hit a target without thinking. Margaret Dalton came by again, ostensibly to borrow flour, but Clara knew better. I heard Voss paid you a visit, Margaret said, her sharp eyes missing nothing. He did, Clara said. And? And I sent him on his way, Clara said. Margaret studied her for a moment, then nodded approvingly. Good. Don't let men like that think they can push you around. I don't intend to, Clara said. Margaret leaned in, lowering her voice. Harding's been putting pressure on everyone in the valley. 3 ranchers have sold out in the last 6 months. Ethan's one of the last holdouts. He's not going to sell, Clara said. I know, Margaret said. That's what worries me. She left shortly after, and Clara stood on the porch, watching the horizon, feeling the weight of what was coming. That night, the attack came. Clara woke to the sound of gunfire, sharp, staccato cracks that shattered the silence. She bolted upright, her heart racing, and grabbed the rifle from beside the bed. In the hallway, she nearly collided with Jacob, who was clutching Samuel's hand, his face white with fear. Stay in your room, Clara said, her voice sharp and urgent. Lock the door and don't come out until I tell you. Where's Pa? Jacob asked. I don't know, Clara said. Go, now. The boys ran back to their room and Clara heard the lock click into place. She moved toward the front of the house, the rifle heavy in her hands, her pulse pounding in her ears. Through the window, she could see shadows moving in the yard, men on foot, spreading out, their faces hidden in the darkness. One of them carried a torch, the flame casting long, flickering shadows. The front door was locked, but Clara didn't trust it to hold. She braced the rifle against her shoulder and aimed at the window, her hand steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. A figure moved past the window, and Clara's finger tightened on the trigger. Then she heard Ethan's voice, loud and commanding, cutting through the chaos. Get off my land! A gunshot answered him, and Clara's breath caught. She moved to the door, unlocked it, and stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit her like a slap, but she barely felt it. She raised the rifle, scanning the yard, and saw Ethan near the barn, his own rifle raised, facing down 2 men who'd taken cover behind a wagon. One of the men saw Clara and started to turn his gun toward her. Clara didn't think. She just fired. The shot rang out loud and final, and the man staggered, clutching his shoulder. He dropped his gun and fell to his knees, cursing. The other man spun toward her, his eyes wide, and Ethan took the opportunity to fire. The bullet hit the ground near the man's feet, and he scrambled back, yelling something Clara couldn't make out. The torchbearer threw his flame toward the barn, and it landed in the snow, hissing and dying. Next one goes through your chest, Ethan shouted. Now get the hell out of here. The men hesitated, then retreated, dragging their wounded companion with them. They disappeared into the darkness, and the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. Ethan stood in the yard, his rifle still raised, his chest heaving. Clara stayed on the porch, her own rifle aimed at the shadows, waiting for them to come back. But they didn't. After a long, tense silence, Ethan lowered his rifle and turned toward the house. He saw Clara standing there, her face pale but her hand steady, and something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or respect? You shot him, Ethan said. He was going to shoot you, Clara said simply. Ethan stared at her for a moment, then nodded. Get inside. Make sure the boys are all right. Clara went back inside, her legs shaking now that the adrenaline was starting to fade. She knocked on the boys' door, and Jacob opened it immediately, his face tight with fear. Are you okay? He asked. I'm fine, Clara said. Your father's fine. It's over. Samuel pushed past Jacob and threw his arms around Clara's waist. his small body trembling. Clara's throat tightened and she rested a hand on his head, holding him close. "It's all right," she said softly. "You're safe." Jacob stood in the doorway, watching her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, there was no anger in his eyes, just fear, and something that might have been gratitude. Ethan came in a few minutes later, blood on his knuckles and exhaustion etched into every line of his face. He looked at Clara, then at the boys, and exhaled slowly. "Anyone hurt?" he asked. "We're fine," Clara said. "Clara." Ethan nodded, then looked at Samuel, who was still clinging to Clara. "You did good, staying in your room." Samuel nodded against Clara's side, and Jacob just stared at the floor. "Go back to bed," Ethan said. "I'll be here if you need me." The boys disappeared into their room, and Clara and Ethan were left alone in the hallway. "You shouldn't have come outside," Ethan said quietly. "Yes, I should have," Clara said. "And you know it." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He just looked at her, really looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. "You're not who I thought you were," he said finally. "Neither are you," Clara said. They stood there for a moment, the space between them charged with something Clara couldn't name. Then Ethan turned and walked toward his room, leaving Clara alone in the dark. She went back to her own room, set the rifle down, and sat on the edge of the bed, her hands still shaking. She'd fired a gun at a man tonight. She'd pulled the trigger and watched him fall, and she didn't regret it. But she also knew, with a cold, creeping certainty, that this was only the beginning. The next morning, Ethan rode into town to report the attack. Clara stayed at the house with the boys and the hired hands, all of them on edge, waiting for trouble that might or might not come. When Ethan returned, his face was grim. "Sheriff says there's nothing he can do unless we can prove Harding ordered the attack," he said. "And since Voss and his men are long gone, we've got no evidence." "So they just get away with it," Clara said, her voice tight with anger. "For now," Ethan said. "But Harding's not stupid. He knows we fought back. He knows we're not going to roll over. That'll make him think twice before he tries again." "Or it'll make him send more men," Clara said. Ethan didn't disagree. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind outside and the creak of the house settling. Her mind kept replaying the attack, the gunfire, the shadows, the moment she'd pulled the trigger. She'd crossed a line tonight, stepped into something violent and irreversible, and there was no going back. But she also knew, with a clarity that surprised her, that she'd do it again. Because this was her home now. These were her people. And she'd be damned if she let someone take that away from her. The following week brought an uneasy calm. No more riders appeared at the gate. No more gunfire shattered the night. But the tension didn't ease. It just settled deeper, like a weight pressing down on all of them. Clara went about her work with a new awareness, her eyes always scanning the horizon, her ears tuned to the sound of approaching horses. The rifle stayed within reach, propped against the wall near the stove, and she checked it every morning to make sure it was loaded. The boys felt it too. Jacob was quieter, more watchful, and he started staying closer to the house. Samuel had nightmares, waking up crying in the middle of the night, and Clara would go to him, sitting on the edge of his bed and holding his hand until he fell back asleep. Ethan worked himself into exhaustion, riding out before dawn and coming back after dark, his face haggard and his temper short. He didn't talk much, but Clara could see the worry in his eyes, the way he checked the locks twice before bed, the way his hand always rested near his gun. One evening, as Clara was cleaning up after dinner, Margaret Dalton arrived again, this time with a basket of preserves and a grim expression. "I heard what happened," Margaret said, setting the basket on the table. "The whole valley's talking about it." "Let them talk," Clara said. Margaret studied her, then nodded. "You're tougher than you look." "I have to be," Clara said. Margaret sat down, folding her hands on the table. "Harding's not going to stop. You know that, don't you?" Clara nodded. "Ethan told me." "He's got the money, the influence, and the men," Margaret said. "And he doesn't take no for an answer. If Ethan keeps refusing to sell, Harding's going to escalate. Next time, it won't just be a warning." Clara's jaw tightened. "Then we'll be ready." Margaret leaned forward, her voice low and urgent. "Listen to me. There are other ranchers in this valley who want to stand up to Harding, but they're too afraid to do it alone. If Ethan can rally them, if he can get them to band together, they might have a chance." "Why are you telling me this?" Clara asked. Because Ethan listens to you, Margaret said. I've seen the way he looks at you. You're not just his wife anymore, you're his partner. And if anyone can convince him to fight smart instead of alone, it's you. Clara didn't know what to say. The idea that Ethan listened to her, that she had any real influence over him, felt foreign and uncomfortable. But she also knew Margaret was right. After Margaret left, Clara found Ethan in the barn, fixing a broken harness by lantern light. She leaned against the doorframe, watching him work. Margaret thinks you should talk to the other ranchers, Clara said. Get them to stand with you against Harding. Ethan didn't look up. I've tried. They're too scared. Maybe they just need someone to take the first step, Clara said. Show them it's possible to fight back and win. Ethan set down the harness, finally meeting her gaze. We didn't win, Clara. We survived. There's a difference. We're still here, Clara said. That's more than Harding expected. Ethan was silent for a long moment, then sighed. Even if I could get them to listen, it's a risk. Harding's got eyes everywhere. If he finds out we're organizing, he'll come down on us hard. He's already coming down on us, Clara said. At least this way we'd have help. Ethan studied her, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. All right, I'll try. Clara felt a flicker of relief, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this was only going to make things more dangerous. Ethan reached out and caught her hand, his grip warm and solid. Thank you, he said quietly. Clara looked down at their joined hands, startled by the gesture. For what? For staying, Ethan said. For fighting. For not running when you had every reason to. Clara's throat tightened. I told you. This is my home now, too. Ethan's gaze held hers for a moment longer. Then he released her hand and turned back to his work. Clara walked back to the house, her heart pounding, and wondered when exactly this cold, practical arrangement had started to feel like something more. 3 days later, Ethan held a meeting at the ranch. 5 other ranchers showed up, their faces lined with worry and suspicion. They sat around the long table in the kitchen, drinking coffee Clara had brewed, and listened as Ethan laid out the situation. Harding's not going to stop, Ethan said. He's going to keep pushing until we're all gone. But if we stand together, if we refuse to sell and back each other up, we've got a chance. A chance to get ourselves killed, one of the men muttered. Or a chance to keep what's ours, Ethan shot back. Your choice. The room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut. Finally, an older rancher named Tom Brennan spoke up. What are you proposing? We form a pact, Ethan said. Any of us gets threatened, the rest of us show up armed and ready. We make it clear to Harding that he can't pick us off one by one. And what if he comes at us all at once? Another man asked. Then we fight, Ethan said simply. Together. The ranchers exchanged glances, uncertainty written on every face. Clara, who'd been standing in the corner, stepped forward. You're all afraid, she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. And you should be. But fear won't save your land. It won't protect your families. Standing together might not guarantee you'll win, but standing alone guarantees you'll lose. The men looked at her, some with surprise, others with grudging respect. Tom Brennan nodded slowly. She's right. We've been too damn scared for too long. One by one, the ranchers agreed. They shook hands, made their pact, and left with grim determination etched into their faces. When they were gone, Ethan turned to Clara. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, Clara said. Someone had to. Ethan looked at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he smiled. A real smile, small and fleeting, but genuine. You're something else, Clara Cross, he said. Clara didn't know how to respond, so she just smiled back and went to clean up the coffee cups. But as she worked, she felt the weight of what they'd just set in motion. The fight was coming, and when it did, there'd be no turning back. The retaliation came faster than any of them expected. 2 days after the meeting, Tom Brennan's barn burned to the ground. Clara heard about it from Margaret, who rode up to the house in the middle of the afternoon with her face flushed and her horse lathered from being pushed too hard. They hit Tom last night, Margaret said, barely waiting for Clara to open the door. Burned his barn, killed 3 horses. Left a note nailed to his fence that said he should reconsider his alliances. Clara's stomach turned. Is Tom all right? He's alive, Margaret said. But he's scared. They all are. Where's Ethan? Clara asked. Out with the others, Margaret said. They rode to Tom's place at dawn. I came to warn you. If Harding's willing to burn Tom out, he won't stop there. Clara nodded, her mind already racing. Come inside. I'll make coffee. Margaret followed her in, and they sat at the kitchen table in tense silence while the coffee brewed. Through the window, Clara could see Jacob and Samuel playing near the barn, oblivious to the danger closing in around them. You need to send the boys away, Margaret said quietly. Clara looked at her. Where? I don't know. Somewhere safe. Somewhere Harding can't reach them. Ethan won't do that, Clara said. He won't send them away. Then you need to convince him, Margaret said, because if Harding's willing to kill horses to make a point, he won't hesitate to hurt children. The words settled over Clara like ice water, and she felt her hands tighten around her cup. I'll talk to him, Clara said. Margaret nodded, finished her coffee, and left. Clara stood at the window, watching the boys, and felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. When Ethan returned that evening, his face was dark with anger. He walked into the house, threw his hat on the table, and stood there for a moment, his jaw clenched so tight Clara could see the muscle jumping. How bad is it? Clara asked. Bad, Ethan said. Tom lost everything in that barn. Tools, feed, 3 good horses. He's talking about selling. Can you blame him? Clara asked. Ethan's gaze snapped to hers. No, but if he sells, the rest will follow, and then we're done. Clara moved toward him, her voice steady. Margaret thinks we should send the boys away, somewhere safe. Ethan shook his head immediately. No. Ethan, I said no, Ethan snapped. I'm not sending my sons away because some bastard wants to scare me into submission. It's not about submission, Clara said, her voice rising. It's about keeping them alive. Ethan's eyes blazed. They're my sons. They stay here. And if something happens to them? Clara demanded. If Harding decides to use them to get to you, what then? Ethan didn't answer. He just turned and walked out of the house, slamming the door behind him. Clara stood there, her heart pounding, her hands shaking with frustration and fear. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. She thought about Tom's barn, about the horses screaming as they burned, about what it would feel like to lose Jacob and Samuel the same way. She got up, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and walked to the boys' room. She opened the door quietly and looked inside. They were both asleep, Jacob curled on his side, Samuel sprawled across his bed, with one arm flung over his head. Clara stood there for a long moment, watching them, and felt something fierce and protective rise up in her chest. She wouldn't let anything happen to them. She didn't care what it cost. The next morning, Ethan was gone before sunrise. He left a note on the table saying he was riding to check the north fence line and would be back by evening. Clara fed the boys breakfast, sent them out to do their chores, and spent the morning cleaning the house with a kind of restless energy she couldn't shake. Around midday, she heard horses again. Her heart kicked into a faster rhythm, and she grabbed the rifle from its place near the stove. She moved to the window and looked out. 4 riders this time. Not Voss, but men she didn't recognize, their faces hard and their intentions clear. Clara's pulse hammered in her ears. She glanced toward the barn where Jacob and Samuel were supposed to be, then back at the riders. They dismounted slowly, deliberately, and started walking toward the house. Clara stepped out onto the porch, the rifle raised and ready. "That's far enough," she called out, her voice cutting through the cold air. The lead rider, a tall man with a scar running down the side of his face, stopped and smiled. "We're not here for trouble, ma'am." "Then you can turn around and leave," Clara said. The man's smile widened. "We're here with a message from Mr. Harding. He wants to make Mr. Cross an offer." "He's not interested," Clara said. "You sure about that?" the man asked. "Because the offer's a good one. More than fair. Mr. Harding's willing to pay top dollar for this land, and all Mr. Cross has to do is sign the papers." "And if he doesn't?" Clara asked. The man's smile faded. "Then Mr. Harding will be disappointed. And when Mr. Harding's disappointed, bad things tend to happen." Clara's finger moved to the trigger. "You need to leave. Now." The man studied her for a moment, then shrugged. "Suit yourself. But you tell Mr. Cross we came by. Tell him the clock's ticking." He turned and walked back to his horse, and the other men followed. They mounted up and rode off, slow and unhurried, like they had all the time in the world. Clara waited until they were out of sight, then lowered the rifle and let out a shaky breath. Jacob appeared from the barn, his face pale. Who were they? Nobody important, Clara said, though her hands were still trembling. They work for Harding, don't they? Jacob asked. Clara hesitated, then nodded. Yes. Jacob's jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked just like his father. I'm not afraid of them. You should be, Clara said quietly. Fear keeps you careful. Jacob didn't respond. He just turned and walked back toward the barn, his shoulders stiff with anger. Clara went inside, set the rifle down, and sank into a chair. She felt the weight of the day pressing down on her, the constant vigilance, the unending tension, and she wondered how much longer they could keep this up. When Ethan came home that evening, she told him about the visitors. His expression went cold and hard, and he didn't say anything for a long time. They're pushing, he said finally, seeing how far they can go before we break. And if we don't break? Clara asked. Then they'll push harder, Ethan said. Clara looked at him, at the exhaustion in his eyes, the lines deepening around his mouth, and she felt something shift inside her. We need to end this, she said, one way or another. Ethan nodded slowly. I know. The next day, Ethan called another meeting. This time, it was at Tom Brennan's place, what was left of it. The ranchers gathered in the yard, standing among the charred remains of the barn, the smell of smoke still thick in the air. Harding's made his position clear, Ethan said, his voice carrying across the group. He's not going to stop until we're all gone. So we have two choices. We can sell and walk away, or we can fight. Fight how? One of the men asked. He's got money, men. Influence. What do we have? We have the truth, Ethan said. We have witnesses to what he's done. We take it to the territorial governor, get the law involved at a level Harding can't control. And if the governor won't listen, another man asked, then we make him listen, Ethan said. We ride to the Capitol, all of us. We bring evidence, witnesses, everything we've got. We make enough noise that Harding can't just sweep it under the rug. The ranchers exchanged glances, uncertainty still written on their faces. Tom Brennan stepped forward. I'm in. I've got nothing left to lose. One by one, the others agreed. It wasn't enthusiasm, just grim determination and the realization that they were out of options. Ethan looked at Clara, who was standing at the edge of the group, and nodded. She nodded back, feeling the weight of what they were about to do. They spent the next week preparing. Clara helped gather documents, write testimonies, and coordinate with the other ranchers' families. She worked late into the night, her fingers cramped from writing, her eyes burning from lack of sleep. Jacob watched her from the corner of the kitchen one evening, his expression thoughtful. You really care about this, don't you? He said. Clara looked up from the papers spread across the table. I care about keeping this ranch, keeping your family safe. Jacob was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry I was mean to you. When you first came. Clara set down her pen. You had every right to be angry. I know, Jacob said, but you didn't deserve it. You were just trying to survive, same as us. Clara's throat tightened. Thank you for saying that. Jacob nodded, then hesitated. My ma, she was different than you, softer, I guess. She didn't know how to shoot a gun or stand up to bad men, but she was good, and she loved us. I know she did, Clara said gently. You're different, Jacob continued, but you're good too, in your own way. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. That means a lot to me, Jacob. Jacob shifted uncomfortably, then mumbled something about checking on Samuel and disappeared down the hall. Clara sat there, staring at the papers in front of her, and felt something settle in her chest, a sense of belonging she hadn't felt since her mother died. The night before Ethan was supposed to leave for the Capitol, Clara found him in the barn, checking the horses. You're really going through with this, she said. Ethan looked up. I am. What if it doesn't work? Clara asked. What if the governor won't listen, or Harding gets to him first? Then I'll figure out another way, Ethan said. But I can't just sit here and wait for him to destroy everything I've built. Clara nodded, understanding. How long will you be gone? A week? Maybe 2, Ethan said. Depends on how long it takes to get a meeting. And while you're gone? Clara asked. You'll be here, Ethan said simply. You and the hired hands. You'll keep things running. Clara's chest tightened. You're putting a lot of faith in me. Ethan stepped closer, his gaze steady. You've earned it. They stood there in the dim light of the barn, the space between them charged with something Clara couldn't name. "Be careful," Clara said quietly. "I will," Ethan said. "You do the same." He reached out and touched her hand just briefly, then turned and went back to checking the horses. Clara walked back to the house, her hand still warm from his touch, and wondered when this arrangement had stopped being about survival and started being about something else entirely. The morning Ethan left, Clara stood on the porch and watched him ride away with Tom Brennan and 3 other ranchers. They looked small against the vast expanse of the Montana landscape. 5 men on horseback, heading toward a battle they might not win. Jacob and Samuel stood beside her, watching until the riders disappeared from sight. "He'll be all right," Clara said, more to herself than to the boys. "How do you know?" Samuel asked, his voice small. "Because he has to be," Clara said. The days that followed were long and tense. Clara kept herself busy with the endless work of running the ranch, but her mind was always on Ethan, wondering where he was, if he was safe, if he'd succeeded. The hired hands stayed close, watching the roads, keeping the rifles loaded. Clara checked the locks every night and slept with one ear open, listening for trouble. On the 5th day, trouble came. Clara was in the kitchen when she heard the sound of horses, too many horses, moving too fast. She grabbed the rifle and ran to the window. At least a dozen riders were coming up the drive, and in the lead was Garrett Voss. Clara's heart slammed into her throat. She turned to Jacob, who was standing frozen in the doorway. "Get Samuel," she said, her voice sharp. "Get him to the root cellar, now." Jacob didn't argue. He ran. Clara moved to the front door, threw it open, and stepped out onto the porch, the rifle raised. Voss pulled his horse to a stop, grinning. "Well, well, the little lady's all alone." "Get off my property," Clara said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. "Your property?" Voss laughed. "That's rich. Where's your husband, Mrs. Cross?" "None of your business," Clara said. Voss dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. "See, I think it is my business, because Mr. Harding's getting real tired of waiting for an answer, and if Mr. Cross isn't here to give one, maybe you can give it for him." "The answer's no," Clara said. "It's always been no." Voss's smile faded. "That's disappointing." He gestured to the men behind him, and they started to dismount. Clara's finger moved to the trigger. "I said get off my property." "Or what?" Voss asked, stepping closer. "You gonna shoot all of us?" "I'll shoot you first," Clara said. "Then we'll see how brave the rest of them are." Voss stopped, his eyes narrowing. "You're bluffing." "Try me," Clara said. For a moment they stood there, locked in a silent standoff. Then one of the hired hands appeared from the barn, rifle in hand, followed by the other. They took up positions on either side of the porch, their weapons trained on Voss's men. Voss's jaw tightened. "This isn't over." "It is for today," Clara said. Voss stared at her for a long moment, then turned and remounted his horse. "Mr. Harding's going to hear about this." "Good," Clara said. "Tell him I said he can go to hell." Voss's face darkened, but he spurred his horse and rode off, his men following. Clara stood on the porch, the rifle still raised, until they were out of sight. Then her legs gave out, and she sank down onto the steps, her whole body shaking. One of the hired hands came over, his expression grim. "That was close, ma'am." "Too close," Clara said. Jacob emerged from the house, his face white. "Is it over?" "For now," Clara said. She looked at him, then at the hired hand. "Double the watch tonight. If they come back, I want to know about it." The man nodded and walked away. Clara stood, her legs still unsteady, and went inside. She found Samuel in the root cellar, huddled in the corner, his eyes wide with fear. "It's all right," Clara said, kneeling beside him. "They're gone." Samuel threw his arms around her neck, and Clara held him tight, feeling the weight of what had just happened. She'd faced down Garrett Voss and a dozen armed men with nothing but a rifle and sheer will, and somehow she'd won. But she knew it wouldn't last. That night Clara sat by the fire, the rifle across her lap, and waited. She didn't sleep, didn't let her guard down, just sat there in the dark, listening. The boys were asleep in their room, the hired hands were on watch, and the house was quiet. But Clara's mind was racing. She kept replaying the confrontation with Voss, kept thinking about the look in his eyes when she'd told him to leave. He'd been testing her, seeing if she'd break without Ethan there to back her up. And she hadn't broken. But next time, he'd come with more men. Next time, he wouldn't leave so easily. Clara tightened her grip on the rifle and stared into the fire, her jaw set. Let him come. She'd be ready. 2 days later, a rider appeared on the horizon. Just one, moving fast. Clara grabbed the rifle and stepped out onto the porch, her heart pounding. But as the rider got closer, she recognized the horse. It was Ethan's. Relief flooded through her, so intense it made her dizzy. Ethan pulled up in front of the house and dismounted, his face haggard and lined with exhaustion. "You're back," Clara said, her voice breaking. Ethan looked at her, and something in his expression made her chest tighten. "We got the meeting. The governor listened. He's sending investigators to look into Harding's operations." Clara's breath caught. "That's good. It's a start," Ethan said. "But it's going to take time. And Harding knows we went over his head. He's going to retaliate." Clara nodded, unsurprised. "He already tried. Voss came here with 12 men." Ethan's expression went dark. "What happened?" "I sent them away," Clara said simply. Ethan stared at her, and then, to her surprise, he reached out and pulled her into his arms. Clara froze, startled, then slowly relaxed into the embrace. She could feel his heartbeat, strong and steady, and the warmth of his body against hers. "I was worried about you," Ethan said quietly, his voice rough. "I was worried about you too," Clara said. They stood there for a long moment, holding each other, and Clara felt something shift between them, something fragile and new, something that felt a lot like hope. Then Ethan pulled back, his hand still on her shoulders, and looked at her. "This isn't over," he said. "I know," Clara said. "But we're going to win," Ethan said, "because we're not doing this alone anymore." Clara nodded, and for the first time since the fight began, she believed him. That night, Ethan told Clara everything. They sat at the kitchen table long after the boys had gone to bed, the lamp burning low between them, and he laid it all out. The meeting with the governor, the promises made, the timeline for the investigation, and the warning they'd received on the way back. "One of Harding's men stopped us outside of Helena," Ethan said, his voice low and tired. "Said Harding knows what we did. Said he's not going to let it stand." Clara's hands tightened around her cup. "What does that mean?" "It means he's going to come at us hard," Ethan said. "He's going to try to finish this before the investigators arrive." "How long do we have?" Clara asked. "A week, maybe 2, Ethan said. "Depends on how fast the territorial office moves." Clara nodded, her mind already working through the possibilities. "We need to fortify the ranch, bring in more men, make sure we can hold out if he tries a full assault." Ethan looked at her, something like admiration flickering in his eyes. "You've been thinking about this." "I've had time to think," Clara said, "while you were gone." Ethan reached across the table and took her hand, his grip warm and solid. "I'm sorry I left you here alone to deal with Voss." "I wasn't alone," Clara said. I had the boys. I had the hired hands." "You know what I mean," Ethan said. Clara looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the exhaustion etched into every line of his face, the weight he'd been carrying for so long without anyone to share it with. "We're in this together now," Clara said quietly. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore." Ethan's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might argue, but then he just nodded, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a gesture so gentle it made her chest ache. "Together," he said. They sat there in the lamplight, hands joined across the table, and Clara felt something settle deep in her bones, a sense of certainty she hadn't felt in months. Whatever was coming, they'd face it side by side. The next morning, Ethan rode out to gather the other ranchers. He came back at dusk with Tom Brennan and 4 others, their faces grim but determined. "We've got 10 days, give or take," Ethan told them. "That's how long until the investigators get here. We just have to hold out until then." "And if Harding doesn't give us 10 days?" one of the men asked. "Then we make him regret starting this fight," Ethan said. They spent the next 2 days fortifying the ranch. They built barricades around the main house, positioned men at strategic points, stockpiled ammunition and supplies. The other ranchers brought their families to Ethan's property, figuring there was safety in numbers. The house filled with people, women cooking in shifts, children playing in the main room, men taking turns on watch. It was chaotic and crowded and exhausting, but it also felt like community, like something worth fighting for. Clara found herself in the middle of it all, organizing meals, settling disputes, tending to a feverish child, and somehow keeping everything running. She worked from dawn until well past dark, falling into bed each night too tired to think. But she also felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. Purposeful. Needed. On the third night, she was washing dishes when Margaret appeared at her elbow. "You're going to work yourself into the ground," Margaret said, taking a dish from Clara's hands and drying it. "I'm fine," Clara said. "You're running on fumes," Margaret countered. "When's the last time you slept more than 4 hours?" Clara didn't answer because she couldn't remember. Margaret set down the dish and turned to face her. "You've done more for this valley in 3 months than most people do in a lifetime. But you're no good to anyone if you collapse. I'll rest when this is over," Clara said. "If you make it that long," Margaret said. Then, more gently, "let the other women help. You don't have to do everything yourself." Clara opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. Margaret was right. She'd been so focused on proving herself, on showing she belonged here, that she'd forgotten she didn't have to do it alone. "All right," Clara said finally. "I'll ask for help." Margaret smiled. "Good. Now go sit down before you fall down." Clara did, sinking into a chair near the fire, and one of the other women brought her a cup of coffee and a plate of food she didn't remember anyone making. She ate slowly, watching the chaos around her, children running between the adults, men cleaning rifles, women mending clothes, and felt something warm and solid settle in her chest. This was what family looked like, messy and imperfect and held together by necessity and choice in equal measure. On the fourth day, a rider came from town with news. Harding had filed an injunction, claiming the ranchers were operating a vigilante group and threatening violence. The local sheriff, who was firmly in Harding's pocket, had issued warrants for Ethan's arrest and Tom Brennan's. "It's a setup," Tom said, his face red with anger. "He's trying to get us locked up before the investigators arrive." "He won't get the chance," Ethan said. "We're not leaving this property. Let him try to serve the warrant here." "That's resisting arrest," one of the other men pointed out. "They could shoot you for that." "They're going to try to shoot me anyway," Ethan said flatly. "At least this way I'll see them coming." Clara, who'd been listening from the doorway, stepped forward. "There's another option." Everyone turned to look at her. "We go public," Clara said. "We ride into town, all of us, and we tell everyone what Harding's done. We make it so loud and so public that he can't just make us disappear." "The town's scared of him," Tom said. "They won't stand with us." "Maybe not," Clara said, "but they'll witness, and witnesses are harder to silence than people hiding on a ranch." Ethan studied her, his expression thoughtful. "It's risky." "So is sitting here waiting for him to come to us," Clara said. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Tom spoke up. "She's right," he said. "We've been reacting to Harding this whole time. Maybe it's time we made him react to us." One by one, the other men agreed. The next morning, they rode into Ridgefield, 15 men, 10 women, and a handful of children. They rode in broad daylight down the main street and stopped in front of the courthouse. A crowd began to gather, curious and wary. Ethan dismounted and stood on the courthouse steps, his voice carrying across the street. "My name is Ethan Cross, and I'm here to tell you what Silas Harding's been doing to the people of this valley." He laid it all out, the threats, the intimidation, the barn burning, the attack on his ranch. One by one, the other ranchers stepped forward and told their stories. Tom Brennan talked about losing his barn and his horses. Margaret Dalton talked about the pressure Harding had put on her late husband before he died. And Clara stood beside Ethan, her presence quiet but solid, her hand resting on the rifle slung over her shoulder. The crowd listened. Some faces were sympathetic, others uncertain, and a few openly hostile, but they listened. Then the sheriff appeared, his face red and his hand on his gun. "That's enough," he said. "Ethan Cross, you're under arrest." "On what charge?" Ethan asked. "Inciting violence," the sheriff said. "Resisting lawful authority." "Lawful authority?" Tom Brennan laughed, bitter and sharp. "You're Harding's dog, and everyone here knows it." The sheriff's hand tightened on his gun. "You want to get arrested too, Brennan?" "Go ahead," Tom said. "Arrest all of us. Let's see how that looks when the territorial investigators show up." The crowd murmured, the tension ratcheting higher. Then a voice cut through the noise. "That won't be necessary." Everyone turned. A man in a dark suit and a badge Clara didn't recognize was walking toward them, flanked by two others. "I'm Marshal Davis," the man said. "Territorial Office. We've been asked to investigate allegations of corruption and intimidation in this region." The sheriff's face went pale. "You're early." "We decided to expedite," the marshal said, his tone flat. "Seems like the situation warranted it." He looked at Ethan. "Mr. Cross, I'd like to hear your testimony, and anyone else who has information about Mr. Harding's activities." Relief washed over Clara so suddenly she felt dizzy. Ethan glanced at her, and she saw the same relief mirrored in his eyes. It wasn't over yet, but they'd made it this far. The next week was a blur of interviews, testimonies, and legal proceedings. The marshal and his team worked quickly, gathering evidence, talking to witnesses, building a case that even Harding's money and influence couldn't dismantle. Harding tried to fight back. He hired lawyers, called in favors, leaned on every contact he had. But the sheer weight of the evidence against him was overwhelming. And when the marshal's team raided Harding's office and found records of bribes, threats, and illegal land deals, the case became ironclad. Harding was arrested on a Tuesday morning, dragged out of his mansion in handcuffs while half the town watched. Garrett Voss and several of his men were arrested alongside him. Clara wasn't there to see it. She was at the ranch, helping the other families pack up and return to their own properties, trying to bring some semblance of normalcy back to a life that had been upended for weeks. When Ethan came home that evening and told her it was done, she just nodded, too exhausted to feel much of anything. "It's really over?" she asked. "It's over," Ethan said. Clara sank into a chair, her whole body sagging with relief. "What happens now?" "Now we rebuild," Ethan said. "Tom's already talking about putting up a new barn. The others are planning to expand their herds. Life goes on." Clara looked at him. "And us?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, his expression serious. "I need to ask you something," he said. Clara's heart kicked into a faster rhythm. "All right, this arrangement we made," Ethan said slowly. "Back when you were desperate, and I was desperate, and neither of us had better options. That's not what this is anymore. Not for me." Clara's breath caught. "What is it then?" Ethan looked at her, his gaze steady and unflinching. "You're my partner, Clara. You've stood beside me through everything. You've protected my sons, defended my home, fought battles I couldn't fight alone. You're not just the woman I married out of convenience. You're the woman I want to spend my life with." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. "Ethan, I'm saying this badly," Ethan interrupted, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "What I'm trying to say is, I want to marry you again. For real this time. Not because we have to, but because I want to. Because I love you." The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Clara stared at him, her heart pounding, and for a moment she couldn't speak. Then she reached across the table and took his hand. "I love you too," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean to. I wasn't looking for it. But somewhere along the way, this stopped being about survival and started being about you. About us." Ethan's smile widened, and he stood, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. They stood there in the kitchen, holding each other, and Clara felt the last piece of the wall she'd built around her heart crumble away. "So is that a yes?" Ethan asked, his voice muffled against her hair. Clara laughed, the sound shaky but genuine. "Yes, it's a yes." They were married again 3 weeks later, this time in front of the whole town. Margaret insisted on organizing it, and Clara didn't have the energy to argue. The ceremony was held at the ranch, in the yard under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Lanterns hung from the trees, and long tables were set up with food the whole valley had contributed to. Jacob and Samuel stood beside Ethan, both of them scrubbed clean and dressed in new shirts Clara had made. Jacob had even combed his hair without being asked. Clara wore a simple dress Margaret had lent her, pale blue with lace at the collar, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers Samuel had picked that morning. When she walked toward Ethan, her hand tucked into Tom Brennan's arm, because he'd offered and she had no one else, she saw the way Ethan's expression softened, the way his eyes never left her face. The ceremony was short and simple, no grand speeches, no elaborate vows, just two people standing in front of their community and choosing each other. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan kissed her, gently at first, then deeper, and the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Clara pulled back, her face flushed, and saw Jacob grinning and Samuel bouncing on his toes with excitement. "Welcome to the family," Jacob said, and this time he meant it. The celebration lasted well into the evening. People ate and drank and danced to music from a fiddle one of the ranchers played. Children ran through the yard, their laughter carrying on the spring air, and for the first time in months, the tension that had gripped the valley was gone. Clara stood at the edge of it all, watching, and felt Ethan's arm slip around her waist. "Happy?" he asked. "Yes," Clara said simply. "I am." They stood there together, watching the life they'd built unfold around them, and Clara thought about how far she'd come. 6 months ago, she'd been a woman with nothing. No home, no family, no future. She'd knocked on a stranger's gate in the middle of a blizzard, desperate and half-frozen, and made a bargain that should have been cold and transactional. But somewhere along the way, that bargain had become something else. It had become a home, a family, a life worth fighting for. She'd learned that survival wasn't just about enduring. It was about choosing to stay even when it was hard, about standing beside someone even when the odds were against you, about building something real out of the broken pieces you'd been given. And she'd learned that love didn't always look the way you expected it to. Sometimes it was quiet and steady, built slowly over shared work and shared risk. Sometimes it was a choice you made every day, to show up and fight and believe that tomorrow could be better than today. Clara leaned into Ethan's side, feeling the solid warmth of him, and smiled. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked. "That I'm glad I knocked on your gate," Clara said. Ethan's arm tightened around her. "So am I." The weeks that followed were quieter, gentler. The threat that had loomed over them was gone, and life settled into a new rhythm. Clara and Ethan moved into the same bedroom, a transition that felt both momentous and entirely natural. They'd already been partners in every way that mattered. This was just the final piece falling into place. The boys adjusted quickly. Jacob started calling Clara Ma, without fanfare, one morning at breakfast, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Samuel had been doing it for weeks already, too young to understand the weight of the word, but old enough to know it felt right. Clara's throat had tightened when she heard it, but she just smiled and passed Jacob the biscuits. She taught Samuel to read and write, his small hand gripping the pencil awkwardly as he traced letters on a slate. She taught Jacob how to cook, over his protest that it was women's work, until he grudgingly admitted that it was useful to know. And she taught them both that strength came in different forms, that it was okay to be scared, okay to grieve, okay to let someone else carry the weight sometimes. Ethan watched her with the boys, and sometimes Clara would catch him looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, maybe. Or wonder. Or something deeper that didn't need a name at all. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains, Ethan said, "You know, I used to think this place was cursed." Clara looked at him, surprised. "Why?" "Because I lost her here," Ethan said quietly. "My first wife. She died in that bedroom, and for 2 years I couldn't walk into this house without feeling like I was suffocating." Clara's chest tightened. "And now?" "Now it feels like a home again," Ethan said. He reached over and took her hand. "You did that. You brought life back into a place that was dying." Clara didn't know what to say. She just squeezed his hand and leaned her head against his shoulder. They sat there in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to deep purple, and Clara felt a peace she hadn't known was possible. By summer, the ranch was thriving. The cattle were healthy, the crops were growing, and the hired hands Ethan had brought on were proving their worth. The other ranchers in the valley were rebuilding too, their solidarity stronger now that they'd faced down a common enemy and won. Margaret came by often, usually with some excuse about borrowing supplies or delivering news, but really just to check on Clara and gossip about the town. "People are still talking about you, you know," Margaret said one afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. "Let them talk," Clara said, kneading dough on the counter. "They're saying you're the reason Ethan held out as long as he did," Margaret continued, "that without you, he would have folded or gotten himself killed." Clara shook her head. "That's not true. Ethan would have fought with or without me." "Maybe," Margaret said, "but you gave him something to fight for besides just survival. You gave him a reason to believe things could get better." Clara paused, her hands stilling in the dough. "He did the same for me." Margaret smiled. I know. That's what makes it work. That evening, Clara found a letter waiting for her on the table. It was addressed in a handwriting she didn't recognize, and when she opened it, she found it was from the territorial governor's office. The letter thanked her for her testimony and her courage, and informed her that Silas Harding had been convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to 15 years in prison. His assets were being seized and redistributed, and several of his associates, including Garrett Voss, were facing charges of their own. Clara read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and set it aside. It was done. Truly, finally done. When Ethan came in from the barn, she showed him the letter. He read it without expression, then set it down and pulled her into his arms. "We won," he said quietly. "We did," Clara agreed. But as she stood there, wrapped in his embrace, Clara realized the victory wasn't just about defeating Harding. It was about everything they'd built in the process, the trust, the partnership, the family they'd become. That was the real win. Fall came, and with it the first frost. The trees turned gold and red, and the air took on a sharp, clean edge. Clara stood in the yard one morning, watching the boys chase each other through the fallen leaves, their laughter bright and unburdened. Ethan came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "You're quiet," he said. "Just thinking," Clara said. "About what?" Clara was silent for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "About how strange life is. 6 months ago, I was standing at your gate with nothing, convinced I was going to die in the snow, and now I'm here, and I have everything." "Not everything," Ethan said. "Not yet." Clara turned in his arms, looking up at him with a question in her eyes. Ethan smiled, a little sheepish, a little nervous. "I was thinking, maybe it's time this family got a little bigger." Clara's breath caught. "You mean a baby," Ethan said. "If you want one. I know we haven't talked about it, and I don't want to assume—" Clara kissed him, cutting off his words, and when she pulled back, she was smiling. "I want one." Ethan's face lit up with a joy so pure it made her chest ache. "Yeah?" "Yeah," Clara said. He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Clara felt the last piece of her old life, the scared, desperate woman who'd knocked on a stranger's gate, fall away completely. She wasn't that woman anymore. She was Clara Cross, wife and mother and fighter, a woman who'd claimed her place in the world and refused to let anyone take it from her. And she was home. By the time winter came again, Clara was visibly pregnant. The boys were ecstatic, Samuel peppering her with questions about whether the baby would be a boy or a girl, and Jacob quietly building a cradle in the barn when he thought no one was watching. Ethan was attentive to the point of being overbearing, constantly asking if she needed to sit down, if she was eating enough, if she was warm enough. "I'm pregnant, not dying," Clara said one evening, exasperated but fond. "I know," Ethan said. "But I lost her, Clara. I lost her and the baby both, and I can't go through that again." Clara's expression softened. She took his hand and placed it on her belly, where the baby was kicking. "Feel that?" she said. "That's your child, strong and healthy, and I'm strong and healthy too. We're going to be fine." Ethan closed his eyes, his hand warm against her stomach, and nodded. The baby came in early March, a girl with dark hair and her father's serious eyes. They named her Rose, after Clara's mother, and from the moment Ethan held her, Clara knew he was lost. He cradled her with a gentleness Clara hadn't known he possessed, his rough hands so careful with her tiny body. And when Rose wrapped her hand around his finger, Ethan's eyes filled with tears. "She's perfect," he whispered. "She is," Clara agreed. Jacob and Samuel were smitten too, taking turns holding their sister and arguing over who got to help Clara with feedings. The house filled with the sounds of a baby crying and cooing and being passed from one set of arms to another, and Clara felt a completeness she'd never imagined possible. One night, when Rose was a few weeks old and finally sleeping through the night, Clara and Ethan sat on the porch together, wrapped in blankets against the cold. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong," Ethan admitted. "For the other shoe to drop." "Nothing's going to go wrong," Clara said firmly. "We've already been through the worst. This is what comes after." "What comes after?" Ethan repeated, like he was testing the words. Clara leaned into him, her head on his shoulder. "Happiness. Family. A life we built together. This is what we fought for." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I used to think happiness was something that happened to you, something you found or lost, like it was out of your control. And now?" Clara asked. "Now I think it's something you build," Ethan said. "Day by day, choice by choice. You choose to show up. You choose to fight. You choose the person standing beside you and the life you want to make together." Clara lifted her head to look at him. "Is that what we did?" "That's exactly what we did," Ethan said. He kissed her forehead, gentle and reverent. "And I'd choose you again, every time." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were good tears, the kind that came from joy too big to hold inside. "I'd choose you too," she said. They sat there together, watching the stars come out over the Montana sky, and Clara thought about the journey that had brought her here. The desperation, the fear, the hard-won battles, and the quiet victories. She'd learned that home wasn't a place you were given. It was something you claimed, something you fought for and built with your own hands. It was the people who stood beside you when everything went to hell, the ones who saw you at your worst and chose to stay anyway. And she'd learned that love didn't always start with passion or romance or grand gestures. Sometimes it started with a desperate bargain in a blizzard. Sometimes it was built slowly, in shared work and shared risk, until one day you looked up and realized the person beside you had become your whole world. Clara reached for Ethan's hand, their fingers intertwining, and felt the weight of everything they'd been through and everything still to come. It wouldn't always be easy. There would be hard winters and lean years, arguments and misunderstandings, moments when the weight of it all felt too heavy to bear, but they'd face it together. And that made all the difference. Spring arrived, and with it came new life. The snow melted, the grass turned green, and the ranch woke from its winter slumber. Clara planted a garden, teaching Samuel how to press seeds into the earth and cover them gently, and watched Jacob help his father mend fences and tend to the cattle. Rose grew, her dark eyes brightening with curiosity, her small hands reaching for everything within grasp. She was a sunny baby, quick to smile, and she wrapped everyone around her tiny finger. One afternoon, as Clara was hanging laundry on the line, Margaret rode up with a basket of fresh bread and a familiar expression. "You look like you have news," Clara said. "I do," Margaret said, dismounting. "Harding died in prison. Heart attack, they said." Clara stilled, a wet sheet in her hands. "When?" "2 days ago," Margaret said. "I thought you'd want to know." Clara nodded slowly, trying to process the information. She'd thought she'd feel something, relief, maybe, or vindication. But all she felt was a distant sadness for a man who'd had everything and thrown it away trying to take more. "Good riddance," Margaret said bluntly. "The world's better off without him." Clara didn't disagree, but she also didn't celebrate. Harding's death didn't erase what he'd done, but it also didn't define her life anymore. "Thank you for telling me," Clara said. Margaret studied her. "You're different than when you first got here. Stronger, maybe, or just more yourself." Clara smiled faintly. "I didn't have much choice. It was adapt or die." "You did more than adapt," Margaret said. "You thrived, and you helped everyone else do the same." After Margaret left, Clara stood in the yard, the basket of laundry at her feet, and looked out at the land stretching before her. It was hers now, in a way that went deeper than ownership. She'd bled for it, fought for it, made it into something worth keeping, and she'd done it not by being perfect, but by being stubborn, by refusing to give up even when everything seemed impossible, by choosing, again and again, to stay and fight and build. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Ethan at the head of the table, Jacob and Samuel on either side, Rose in her cradle nearby, and Clara serving up a meal she'd made with her own hands, she felt a contentment so profound it brought tears to her eyes. This was what she'd been searching for all along. Not a perfect life, but a real one. Not an easy path, but one worth walking. "You all right?" Ethan asked, noticing her expression. Clara wiped her eyes and smiled. "I'm perfect." And she meant it, because sometimes perfect didn't mean flawless. Sometimes it meant exactly where you were supposed to be, scars and all, surrounded by people who'd seen you at your worst and loved you anyway. Sometimes perfect was a cold bargain that turned into something warm. A desperate choice that became a life. Sometimes perfect was just home.